Good evening, everybody. My name is John Taves, and I'm the event coordinator at McNally Robinson Booksellers. Thank you all so very much for joining us here tonight as we celebrate the virtual launch of Fire, Folly, and Fiasco, Why It Took 100 Years to Build the Manitoba Museum. And that is, of course, a book by James A. Burns, published by Woolly Mammoth Publishing. We'll be joined in just a moment by your host for the evening. But first, we're broadcasting tonight live from Treaty 1 territory, the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. Now, just to review a few details about this evening, there will be a bit of a presentation and a conversation, after which there'll be time for questions from all of you out there. You'll notice that immediately at the bottom of your Zoom screen, there is a Q&A option, so feel free to write questions in throughout the evening. You won't disturb anybody by asking a question, and we'll only read them out loud at the end when it comes time to actually pick Jim's brain a little bit about this fascinating topic. I won't take up too much more of your time. I'll be back at the end of the event to let you know how you can purchase signed copies of this book as well. But first, I'd like to introduce your host for the evening. Dr. Gordon Goldsborough is an aquatic biologist at the University of Manitoba and the author of the already classic books, Abandoned Manitoba and More Abandoned Manitoba, both published by Great Plains Publishing. He's also the president of the Manitoba Historical Society. So I'd invite you all to join me in putting your virtual hands together to welcome Gordon Goldsborough.
Well, thank you, John. That's a very gracious introduction, and thank you for the plug of my books. But of course, we're not here to talk about my books this evening. We're in fact here to talk about Jim Burns's book. It's my privilege to introduce you all to Dr. James A. Burns, my good friend and author of the book Fire, Folly, and Fiasco, Why It Took 100 Years to Build the Manitoba Museum. Now, to say that this book is a labor of love is an understatement. You know, Jim Burns has had a long and distinguished career in the presentation of the natural sciences in a museum context, having been a curator of Ice Age fossils at the Royal Alberta Museum for over 22 years. His association with the museums goes back even farther, beginning actually in 1968, when, as a graduate student, he haunted the vertebrate collections at the Royal Ontario Museum in Toronto. Now, since then, Jim has worked in 3 other great Canadian museums at Ottawa, at Edmonton, and here in Winnipeg. While in Edmonton, the provincial government sent him twice as a member of the museum teams to Alberta's sister province, Heilongjiang in China, where he applied his expertise to identifying fossils at several ancient sites. Now, a Torontonian by birth, and we don't hold that against him at all here in Western Canada, Jim's early archaeological work from the late 1960s to the mid-1970s involved excavations and analyses of bones from sites from New Brunswick through to British Columbia. In 1974, an opportunity presented itself to work in Ice Age caves in Alberta, which subsequently led to his doctoral studies. Now, after receiving his PhD from the University of Toronto in 1984, Jim spent the next 24 years excavating, researching, and reporting on fossils from Alberta caves and gravel pits. He also began editing gallery texts for the museum, as well as publications at the Royal Alberta Museum, starting in the 1990s and slowly building an editing business on the side, so that when he retired in 2006, Jim actually continued to work as an editor for clients as diverse as the Royal Ontario Museum, the Delta Marsh History Group, and most recently for Engineers and Geoscientists Manitoba. Now, what is particularly relevant to me is that in 2009, he joined the editorial team for the Manitoba Historical Society's journal, Manitoba History. It's recently been renamed as Prairie History, and Jim's thoroughness and his knowledge of arcane aspects of grammar and punctuation are really very much appreciated. Now, as a biologist myself, who also works in the field of history, I'm proud to say that Jim is a valued member of a small but dedicated group of scientists here in Manitoba who bring the rigor of the scientific method to bear on historiography. I have long maintained that scientists bring a refreshingly different perspective to the writing of history, an approach that is founded in mathematics and statistics and is inherently visual. I'm sure that Jim understands my frustration when dealing with authors of learned works of history who, when asked to supply photographs and other illustrations to accompany their contributions to prairie history, well, they often respond with blank stares. Now, I'm happy to say that it was an absolute delight to work with Jim in preparing his book for publication. Fire, Folly, and Fiasco, his first book, combines his years of experience as a scientist in the worlds of museums and the worlds of books. There's just far more photographs than we could ever hope to include in this book. A problem that I would love to have with other historians. Well, I will let you hear and see more about Fire, Folly, and Fiasco from Jim himself in the full knowledge that it is a visual treat as well as a ripping good story. I'll close by simply adding that Jim lives here in Winnipeg with his wife, journalist and author Sheila Jones. Jim, take it away.
Well, thank you very much, Gord. A very flattering introduction. I appreciate that very much. I might also thank the viewers who have tuned in, opting to watch a book launch rather than the NHL draft. I appreciate that very much. Certainly, great thanks to John Taves of McNally Robinsons for arranging this marvelous talk. I mean, the electronics are beyond me, but he handles it very well. Gord agreed to be the host for the evening, and I might notice that, or might bring to your notice that he also designed the book, and I think he did a marvelous job, and thank you so much for that, Gord. I'd also like to thank my wife, Sheila, who is my toughest critic, my biggest fan, a sharp editor, and my helpmate. And she's amazing. I thank you all very much. All right, let's get on to the show here. The idea for the book came from a time back in about 2008 and on to towards the present, when I was looking over the collections of Ice Age fossils at the Manitoba Museum, just to check them out and see if there were errors. Oops. And I noticed a lot of labels on the specimens with names, with the names Rand and Stokes, Harry Rand and Percy Stokes. And I asked the curator, Dr. Graham Young, of the Paleontology and Geology Department, if he knew who these folks were. He said he didn't, and I kind of forgave him for that because they were collecting for the museum in the Winnipeg Auditorium, which began in 1932, was opened in 1932. So they collected in the 30s and 40s, and well, Graham's not that old, and nor am I for that matter. So there were those two names, Rand and Stokes, came up, and I wanted to find out more about them. And in the doing, I came across two books of minutes of the meetings of the Manitoba Museum Association, which administered that museum in the auditorium. And I found two things that were really quite, well, they were revelations to me. As a person from away, as they say, I was unaware of the existence of that museum. So reading those minutes just opened up a great vista for me, and it was really, really fascinating. The other thing was that there simply was no history of any of the museums in Winnipeg. Sources of information, but no history had been put together. So The story that I have told starts at Confederation. Manitoba's joining Confederation on the 15th of July, 1870, and it goes right up to the 15th of July, 1970, when the current museum opened its doors. So it was exactly 100 years. Now, the title sets the tone for much of the book, although there are much brighter times that peek through the story from time to time. And there is a cast of heroes. There always has to be a heroic element to a book. Now, the first collection that came under fire, literally, was the First Legislature, which was located in Andrew Bannatyne's house. The legislature sat in that house from 1871 to 73, and in December 1873, it burnt down, went right to the ground, all ashes. An interesting story about how the contents were rescued. It was a December evening, minus 30 degrees Fahrenheit, cold and blustery, and the first responders went in, went up to the second floor where the ledge was, opened the windows, and threw great bundles of records and books and furniture and so on out the windows to the people waiting below. I assume they weren't aiming. And this is all very nicely explained in a newspaper article in Joseph Royal's Francophone newspaper, Le Métis. Much of the contents, as I say, were saved. A few things were lost, but two of the things that were particularly important were the mace, which is the symbol of authority of the legislature to enact laws, and the speaker's chair. And you'll see some pictures a little later. The important thing here is it should have been a siren call to the honorable members of the legislature to establish a fireproof repository for all of this irreplaceable material, the records of the birth of the province, various artifacts like the mace and the chairs and some of the other furniture, and even materials that went back as far as 1812 rather, to the Selkirk settlers' arrival in Red River. It should have been a siren call, but they ignored it studiously. There are so many stories in this book. It took me a good chunk of the 10 years or so to put it all together. So I can't tell you the whole story, and I shouldn't. This is not telling you the book. The pivotal event occurring in 1893 was Manitoba's participation in the Chicago World's Fair of that year. Now, Premier Greenway, Thomas Greenway, didn't see eye to eye with the Prime Minister, Wilfrid Laurier, and so he declined Laurier's offer to join the federal government and the other provinces under one roof at the fair. Greenway said, no, Manitoba's bigger than that, better than that. We need more space to show the great wealth and abundance of Manitoba. They decided that they would go alone. They couldn't get space inside the fair because it was all gone by the time he made this decision. So they built a hotel across the road, across Stony Island Avenue. And within that, they provided 10,000 square feet of exhibition space, a main floor area and a mezzanine, a balcony around the second floor. That was an amazing amount of space to allot to an exhibition. Now, the newspapers really didn't take well to Greenway's expenditures. He was the Minister of Agriculture and Immigration, for one thing, and he spent half the department's budget on this exhibition. And so the reporters just took them to the cleaners on that one and said this was a colossal waste of money. For example, the Natural History Collection, which had a lot of taxidermic specimens, stuffed animals and birds, they said that's an awful lot of money to spend on a bunch of dead things when there are people who are starving in Winnipeg and public works are being neglected. So, but the idea, his major idea was, we're big and bountiful and wonderful and wealthy. We need settlers. And the federal government is offering free tracts of land, 160 acres. And we would like people to come to Manitoba, break the land, farm it, become citizens of this great province. The natural history and indigenous collections particularly were very good in the exhibition, and the Smithsonian Institution in Washington and the Field Museum, an upstart in Chicago, both wanted to buy portions of the collection. Smithsonian wanted the ethnographic, indigenous cultural materials, and the Field Museum wanted the natural history specimens, particularly the stuffed birds. And that might have been a good idea to sell it to them, but the government said, no, we will not accept your handsome offers for those collections. It might have been a better thing if they had accepted it, because those collections might still be in existence. I don't want to throw out the baby with the bathwater, so to speak. So I won't divulge the denouement of this tawdry tale of destruction by fire of the collections that were to be showcased in Winnipeg, according to Greenway, whose promise was quite hollow. This put an end to the aspirations of the citizens who wanted a real museum, and it didn't, in fact, come to fruition for another 37 years. It was kind of a sad chapter in the history. The epitome of folly, one of several. There are examples of fire, there are examples of folly and fiasco, but the folly I could put down to the inability of the government to commit to creating something needed, much wanted, much desired as an institution such as a museum. The government just didn't seem to be interested, and the citizens were angry. So during the Great Depression then, in the 30s, late 20s, early 30s, Ottawa gave a great pile of money to various cities across the country to put people back to work. Minimum wage perhaps, but they got put to work. And Winnipeg decided, well, there were two things they wanted to do, and one of them was to put up a civic auditorium. There was no large place like that for having big meetings in Winnipeg at that point, and so that was a desperately needed building. The city, in fact, became the owner of the building, and so the museum and art gallery that were included in that building were city-run enterprises. The city offered free heat, light, and water, and they even came along with some grants for operating budget. So the city was very generous. The province, well, they didn't come through nearly as well, not to the same level of support. So the museum opened in December of 1932. It was run by the Manitoba Museum Association, which was led by the coroner, the provincial coroner of the time, Dr. Harry Speechley. He was a wonderful man, a very eclectic, had very eclectic interests, and was a real workhorse. He had many interests and many jobs, but particularly he was a coroner. In the mid-30s, he was running anywhere from, well, over 400 postmortems and inquests. So he's very busy with that, but all kinds of other things. So he and his executive council then ran this museum, certainly till he retired in 1947, and it went on to other people, other presidents were elected and so on, but he and his little cadre of people were, in my estimation, the heroes of this piece. They kept that auditorium museum going through the Depression, through the Second World War, and the Second World War, maybe doldrums, but sort of rearranging, realigning the economy, and things were a little slow for a while. They kept them going. The budgets they had were absolutely laughably small. And the other and that's always a problem with things like museums and art galleries. Funding is chronically inadequate, but also the space. They didn't have any space to expand. When you have an institution that collects objects, whether it be art or artifacts or specimens, natural history specimens, whatever, you are going to run into a situation where you've got no more space. You need space for storage, for preparation of specimens, and for display. And there just wasn't any extra room at the auditorium. So they hobbled along with some interesting events happening, of course, but and I think you'll be pleased at some of the stories that they had to tell. So by about 1960 or a little after that, professionalism started creeping into the world economy, into the way things were done. Professions were made much more professional, and that held for the museum as well. In 1965, the Manitoba Museum Association was disbanded and was replaced by a board of directors of the Manitoba Museum of Man and Nature. And many of the local audience will remember that name and probably visited it many times. I hope they visited it many times. It was led by Dr. Frank Mathewson, and it really moved ahead. They started to bring in professional consultants, architects, curatorial staff, and administrative staff. It was a business. It was turning into a real live business, and they needed professional people to run it and keep an even keel. It took 5 years to build the Manitoba Museum of Man and Nature. It was later renamed to the Manitoba Museum for obvious reasons. And 100 years then from Confederation to the opening of that museum, a true standalone, devoted museum, probably fireproof. I'm not going to go any further on that one. 2020 then is the 50th anniversary of our present day museum. It's the 150th anniversary of Manitoba. The Edmonton Police Service is 100 years old. And the Hudson's Bay Company is 350 years old this year. So it's a big year. And I believe all of those anniversaries began on the 15th of July. I don't think that was a coincidence. I'm sure that was on purpose. Well, there were, as I say, some light, bright moments that peeked through the doom and gloom. I call on Dr. Speechley to tell us a little bit about that. He was a very well-connected person around town, a coroner, well-respected, a lot of contacts, and one group of contacts were, of course, the funeral directors. The Bardolls, the Clarks, the Leatherdales, people like that. And his habit was to call them up. If somebody had a collection to donate to the museum, they'd call him up and say, "We've got this stuff, would you come and get it?" And he would call, say Bill Leatherdale, and say, "Can I borrow a hearse for the day so I can go and pick up this collection?" And they'd be very happy to do so because, well, that was their sort of nod to public service. And one particular event in 1934 brought a collection of Selkirk settler artifacts back to the museum using Leatherdale's hearse. When he got there to East St. Paul, where this dilapidated log cabin was placed, he found that the roof was damaged. It was leaking snow melt water, rainwater, whatever, and somebody had let the chickens in. So the place was dampened by water damage and yucky feathers and guano and the like. It was kind of a nasty mess, but he salvaged a bunch of the material, brought it back to the museum, and 2 years later, after some serious work by Harry Rand and by the local artist Angus Short, whom some of the viewers will remember. He died a few years ago, but was something of a fixture in Winnipeg. They put together a marvelous reconstruction of a Selkirk settler's cabin using the artifacts that Speechley had brought back. Those items, of course, are in the museum now. They passed from the Auditorium Museum into the current Manitoba Museum. Another effort, George Smith, the chief constable, was a very good friend of Speechley's. And one day he came to the museum with a truckload of confiscated pinball machines. In 1938, the laws had been put in place to ban gambling machines particularly, including pinball machines, slot machines, and the like. And so he brought these 8 pinball machines to the museum for repurposing as display cases. Well, what a wonderful gesture. And it just shows you it's not what you know, it's who you know. So Smith did a big favor for the museum. Also in 1934, and this is a little more serious idea from the history. In 1934, there were boulder mosaics discovered in Whiteshell Forest Preserve. These are more properly called petroforms, purposely constructed patterns of rocks in the park, usually on bare rock surfaces, and effigies of animals, snakes and turtles, particularly humans as well. And Speechley and his group at the museum were apprised of this occurrence, and they went to visit and decided that this was definitely indigenous workings, that indigenous people had put them together, had laid out these patterns, but there was no sign of artifacts, so they couldn't tell who had done these works, and there was nothing to date. There were no artifacts that might be radiocarbon dated, even though in 1938, radiocarbon dating hadn't been invented. So he went to the Minister of Natural Resources, Mines and Natural Resources, to see if they could afford some protection for the sites, perhaps an RCMP patrol by the several sites in the reserve, or maybe a game warden or park warden could be appointed to protect them. Fine. A short time later, the story came out that somebody wanted to purchase some of the rocks, and for what reason wasn't stated. But again, Speechley and his fellows objected. They said, this is wrong. You can't destroy these sites by removing parts of them. But what can we do? And so the minister's deputy came up with a wonderful idea. He said, rocks are made of minerals, and minerals belong to the province in the right, to the crown in right of the province of Manitoba, and cannot be removed or sold without the minister's permission. And of course, that won't be forthcoming, will it? So in a sense, they prevented the vandalism, or at least this episode of vandalism, not exactly by design with a targeted piece of legislation, but rather it was a ruse. They used a kind of obscure part of yet another law. And I argue that this was an event that precipitated the future antiquities laws in Manitoba to protect archaeological sites. They needed protection, and so the laws would come in. And for at the present time, all of the provinces and territories have antiquities laws. So what it said was that the museum people were viewed as qualified and recognized for advice they could give to the Crown in certain matters. Okay, now I'm going to go to a few slides just to illustrate some of the points I was making. And I hope this works all right. I will share the screen, and I will share that screen. Pardon me, this is technology. Anyway, you can see here 3 horses going hell-bent for leather, hauling a 6,000-pound steam pumper to a fire. I'm told by George Tredenick at the Firefighters Museum in Winnipeg here that wouldn't last very long. Those horses would be dead if they had to go very far at that pace. That was a heavy, heavy load. But what it reminds us of is the constant dread of fire in early Winnipeg, in early any city really, because the buildings were largely made of wood. And in a place like Winnipeg, cold winters, fires to keep warm, fires to cook by, and so on. So this was something very important to keep in mind. The first legislature, as I said, burned down in 1873, but some of the materials in there were rescued. In this case, the official mace, there's a legend about it. Don't know if it's true or not, and I won't go into that, but you can find information on the Manitoba Historical Society's website about it. This lies in the current speaker's office. The chair over here is the speaker's chair that was recovered from that log building. It was recovered, and it was also recovered. One thing I didn't mention for time was some of the run-up to museums in Manitoba, but probably in many other jurisdictions. Agricultural fairs in the rural areas brought together people who would bring their grain or their animals, their livestock, to the fair for competitions. And there'd be some strenuous competitions to see who had the best this or the best that, so on. Early on, they didn't have too many other kinds of competitions, but as time went by, they admitted things such as photography competitions or art competitions. And finally, taxidermy. Taxidermy was a Victorian era thing. People wanted to bring nature into their homes, so they went to the taxidermist to get a stuffed animal mount or a bird or whatever. Now, this is a typical taxidermist shop on Main Street, Edward Darby's shop. I think it's become a bit of a famous picture here in Winnipeg. I'd like to think I started it with an article in Manitoba History in 2010. You can see various kinds of animals. A couple of seal pups here that I'm pointing out. There's a badger, a fox, a rabbit, and probably a coyote. You see the walrus skull on the wall. Over here, the birds, some ptarmigans in a case. And these bison skulls, that's a long story. And if you read the book, you'll catch some idea of that. And there is reference to my article in 2010, which gives the background to this very historic photograph by Benjamin Foote. But I think this was kind of a help to precipitate the move towards erecting or establishing museums. John Palmerston Robertson was the chief librarian in the legislature. He had charge over, oh boy, the library, the archives, and the so-called provincial museum. He wasn't trained for being a museum person, but he took it on, and he had under his wing several hundred stuffed birds, some cultural artifacts, indigenous curios, as they called them in those days. I don't see any evidence of them in his office, but he sprinkled them around the library, which was vanishingly small, so there wasn't an awful lot of it. But anyway, he was a major mover in the museum thing, perhaps unwittingly. The World's Columbian Exposition in 1893 in Chicago to celebrate the 400th anniversary of the discovery of the New World by Christopher Columbus. Too much political squabbling, and it was delayed a year, so it went in 1893 instead of the previous year. Manitoba's participation, well, here's the hotel, 400 guest hotel, went right through the block from one side to the other. And the museum, or not museum, the exhibition stretched from about here over to here. And all of the first floor back about 100 feet in the building, and the mezzanine on the second floor. There's no mention of the World's Fair because they were not officially part of it, but you get Exhibit of Manitoba, at least on the front, and Province of Manitoba. The photoshopping's a little laughable. The centerpiece of the exhibit was this stack of stooks, as I call it, just showing the abundance of grain, and it was wonderful quality grain. It has the moose head here, a cow, probably a cow head, and it just showed so much abundance and wealth. You can see the mezzanine up in behind, and flags and bunting all over the place. It was a real affair. One of the animal cases was a bird case. You can see whooping crane, sandhill crane, pelican, goose, loon, golden eagle, great blue heron, an owl. It was just beautiful. The case itself was a work of art. You see the neat little legs that it's sitting on. Wonderful. I didn't have a chance to mention the wonderful work that the Masons did in 1898. I don't have any pictures from that year, but they staged a wonderful pop-up museum, a people's pop-up museum, where they borrowed specimens from the citizens, and they took all the furniture out, rolled up the carpets, and opened the place up to exhibits. There were 300 contributors to the collection, and they had to get glass cases, they had to get extra insurance, and so on. This is Charles Napier Bell laying the cornerstone of this building, and so then we go on to and that exhibition was an absolute success, and it didn't take us a penny of taxpayers' money. It was just a fabulous show. The Industrial Bureau, a business enterprise, had nothing to do with the city of Winnipeg or the province, where businesses could set up kiosks or little cubicles and sell their wares or whatever. On the first floor, somewhere in the middle, was a museum. run by an eccentric physician named John Bond. It was creditable enough, but it wasn't really a true museum. It had a lot of good stuff in it, some good exhibits, but it was marginal in terms of its fidelity to the ideals of a museum. The University of Manitoba had two museums, one in the geology department, another in the biology department. This one in biology, you can see the standard kind of glass cases with stuffed birds in them. Oh, another whooping crane over here. That was a prized specimen for any museum. A couple of moose heads, probably coyote, I guess, here, rabbit and beaver. Notice the sprinkler system, so they were really up to date. Another part of the museum had these flitches. They're longitudinal sections of trees showing the bark, and this exemplified the wealth of timber in Manitoba. A couple of moose snouts here. They're actually on plaques like this, but they're lying on the plaques. At the same time, pretty much the same time, the Hudson's Bay Company decided they had to stage a museum in their Main Street store. They scoured the empire for all manner of artifacts and documents, maps and logs, journals, that kind of thing. 630 square feet, so it was pretty tiny, but packed with good stuff. They moved in 1926 to the Portage Avenue store, and of course had much more room to flex their muscles. Red River carts and their boats down here, dugout and a kayak, a model of the Nunsuch, which is sort of symbolic of the birth of the Hudson's Bay Company. There's some indigenous costuming, clothing over here, rifles, that kind of thing. Those three museums, geology and biology at the U of M and the Hudson's Bay, were the only three museums in Manitoba that were accredited by a massive survey by the Carnegie Foundation Trust in the UK. And that was a real feather in their caps. My heroes, as I call them, of the Auditorium Museum on St. Mary Avenue at Vaughan Street in Winnipeg here. Dr. Harry Speechley, the coroner, he was the president of the MMA and Museum Association for 14 years. His keeper, Harry Rand, he was 60 when he joined the staff, an inveterate collector of archaeological material from in England, where he came from, and he just proved to be indispensable, maybe a little expensive at times, but indispensable in the running of the museum. Leonard Norris Ely, trained as a lawyer, practiced here in Winnipeg for a number of years, shifted gears and went to teach at Ravenscourt School for several years, and then went on to be the director of the Manitoba Museum from 1938 to 1952, when he had a stroke and he passed away several years later. And the fourth one, to add a little color, Miss Rosamond Anderson. She and Harry Rand met somehow. I don't know the circumstances. They were very, very good friends, platonic as far as I know, but she was just wonderful in the museum as a docent, teacher. She would guide people around the museum gallery and answer questions, and she was great at soliciting donations to the silver collection, which was a good thing because her recompense for all this work was half the takings of the donations box. Winnipeggers of seniors' years will remember this plesiosaur, which would be the first thing they saw when they came in the museum. This here is one of the double doors at the entrance of the museum. You open the doors and this is the first thing you see. I have a couple of interviews with gentlemen now who, as children, came into the museum and they recoiled and moved back. One of them said he took a couple more tries before he could actually enter the room. It was so scary for him. This is the same room A little further back, you can see the plesiosaur there. And along this wall, indigenous clothing and artifacts of various kinds. There's some headdresses here, rawhide shirt, and probably, I think there are bows and arrows down in this area. Down the middle here, we have archaeological specimens, stone adze heads, mauls like hammers that could be hafted to a piece of wood, set of array heads, what we in the business call projectile points. And there's an Inuit kayak, skin-covered kayak above the showcase there. Again, packing a lot of stuff into a small space. And earlier on, these are not coeval pictures. This was earlier. There's a passenger pigeon there and a series of animals. Oh, sorry about the bad pun. The good queen banned the bad punster, but she missed me. So these are exhibits, what it looked like in the past. And I suspect there are some viewers out there who may have seen these in person at the time. Moving on to 1947, Richard Sutton came on the staff of the museum as a technician, a paid technician too. He had volunteered before the war, and having come back after the war, he came on as a technician, rose to the post of director in 1954. Here he is in 1960 in the White Shell Forest Reserve at the museum there, explaining a specimen to somebody at the museum. A sort of press picture here 6 years later, and over here an image of him and his designer admiring their work. This is a Megatherium, giant ground sloth from South America. And that specimen, like the Treherne plesiosaur, are threads of continuity. They're both still in the museum today. And just as a reminder, this is one shot of the petroforms at Bannock Point in White Shell. There's a turtle here facing down a snake, the classic feud between good and evil. And it just reminds us of the part that the museum took in precipitating antiquities legislation. So that's the end of it for me, the end of my story. There are so many holes in it. You just have to buy the book and read it and get the full flavor of it. Now, this would be a good time to take questions and answers. But first, before I do that, I would like to call on Gord's wife, Maria, to present a little something to Gord. If he can come up live there, we could make this little presentation. Of course, with COVID, I can't be there, he can't be here, so we have to do this this presentation live on camera. So if your wife Maria could enter the scene.
Just coming in the room now.
Just coming in the room now.
Oh, look at that. We'll bring it in front of the camera.
It says a Nobel Award or prize, I think, a Nobel Prize for Achievement to Dr. Gordon Goldsborough, the discoverer of the 48-hour day. It was originally dated on the 2nd of April when we were going to run this launch, but it obviously didn't happen. It's been postponed. Gord, thank you so very much for your friendship, for all your help, your encouragement with the book, your help with the book, designing it, and all those things. This is my heartfelt thanks for all your help.
Well, thank you, Jim. What little I did simply accentuated the wonderful work you've done to bring this story to light. You know, I knew nothing about the Manitoba Museum's history. I knew little snippets here and there, but you've strung it all together in such a way that wow, I think Manitobans generally are just going to be amazed when they see the whole story. So thank you for doing this book. Thank you for spending, I guess, 10 years putting it all together. And I think it's a story well worth it, worth the effort. So thank you. We now will, I guess, turn to our Q&A session. And this is where people who have questions for Jim can lodge them. The best way to do it is to type them into the Q&A window, and either John Taves or I will see them and we'll pass them on to Jim. There is one right now, Jim, from a fellow I suspect you know, a fellow named Paul Newsom.
Ah, yes.
And Paul has asked, what was the most surprising thing you found during your research on the Manitoba Museum?
I have to say that the story of the Chicago World's Fair was just the most unnerving thing. Well, unnerving, but surprising thing that I discovered. It had been written up in the papers, of course, and there are many references in the newspapers to the various personalities and gaffes and mistakes and the reporters calling Greenway down for the extravagance. That's a story I don't think too many people these days are aware of, and I thought that's got to be something we bring to their attention, because it's neat stuff. And yes, I short-circuited the story in the talk here. It goes much better in the book. Thank you, Paul.
Are there any other questions for Jim? Well, while we're waiting, maybe I'll pose a question for you, Jim. So early in your presentation, you said that there has been no previous histories of the museums in Winnipeg. Why do you think that's so? Why have there been no previous histories? There's been histories on all kinds of other things. Museum, you'd think, would be unnatural. Why not?
Well, it's a good question. I'm not sure I have an answer for it. They didn't have a lot of staff on, a lot of people on the staff, and most of them were either interested in collecting things in the field. Harry Rand was an inveterate, pot hunter, but anyway, there were curators, honorary curators who were never paid, many of whom were professors at the university, and I suppose they could have produced histories, but they had their day jobs, and maybe that just wasn't in their cards. Oh boy, the Historical and Scientific Society of Manitoba, which was established in 1879 by a group of people who were just madly interested in everything historical about Manitoba, could well have done something like that. They were collecting whatever they could. They had a fine library, something of an archives, and even a museum. I'm not sure just how public those things were, but I guess people just weren't all that aware of it. It was essentially a private museum, whereas the Auditorium Museum was definitely for the public. So it's a good question, and I guess I haven't really thought about that.
A bunch more questions here have been posed. So one from Greg is, has the museum ever had any major expeditions to collect specimens?
Well, mostly I think they were involved in projects in Manitoba. I don't think they went outside that much. There were certainly excavations of burial mounds, ancient Indian burial mounds, which of course doesn't happen these days, but in those days it was okay, or it was deemed to be okay. I'm not sure that the indigenous folks had a lot to say about it, for better or worse. There was the Treherne plesiosaur that was a big project that involved a university professor Kirk, who started he started in on the project and unfortunately died before it was finished. They had to bring in Dr. Norris Russell from the National Museum in Ottawa to finish that one. There were other excavations, and certainly as we got up into the more modern era, there were archaeological investigations that produced materials that are in the museum now. But as far as major excavations, you think of exotic things like maybe going to China or somewhere in the States or wherever. No, I don't think there was anything along those lines.
So a question from another Jim who asks, whatever happened to the Manitoba Hotel after the Columbian Exposition?
That one I know about. One of the things they tried to do, because the hotel was a flop and it lost a lot of money, it was supposed to make its own way. It was supposed to recoup the cost of building it, and it didn't, and lost money. In the end, at the end of the World's Fair, it was sold to an entrepreneur for $1,200, which was about, I don't know, 3% of the original cost, something like that. And he tore it down for the wood so that he could use it to construct a resort hotel on some lake in Minnesota, I think it was. So it was kind of an ignominious end for that poor hotel.
Question from Alwyn. Jim, were you able to interview any former museum staff? And did they provide you with useful context for the more recent parts of the story?
Staff in the sense of current staff in the Museum of in the Manitoba Museum, yes, I interviewed a number of them, but from earlier times, I did have the very good luck of being able to interview both Oliver and Richard Norris Ely, the sons of Leonard Norris Ely. And Oliver had been collecting photographs and in fact wrote a history of his father, not just as relating to the museum, but his basically his life history. And that was really useful. Richard had some interesting information as well. He sort of followed Oliver's lead on that, though. Who else? There was another person. Well, Norris Ely, of course, was a teacher at Ravenscourt School here in Winnipeg, and I consulted the archivist there, Ms. Kella Grabish, and got some photographs and information on Norris Ely. I spoke with a number of his the students that he taught, and so I did have some true historical content to it, not just written material, and that was really uplifting and a very wonderful experience.
There's a question from one of your informants at the Manitoba Museum, your friend Graham Young. He asks, what did you discover about collections at the Carnegie Library? Certainly we, and by which he means the Manitoba Museum, have substantial rock and mineral collections that were parts of the library collection, but I didn't know anything about them beyond my familiarity with the specimens, all of which came from Foote of Philadelphia.
Interesting question. I know that the Carnegie Library, and there were three of them in Winnipeg. He's referring to the one on William Street, or William Avenue. And I know that they had a collection. They had some domestic materials like china and furniture and things of that sort. And I knew that they had some mineral samples. They tried to, the museum tried to get the bison that were there at the Carnegie Museum, and they managed to transport them over to the auditorium. These were taxidermy mounts. they could well have been from Edward Darby's shop. I'd have to check the records to see about that. But yeah, some of these things have survived, and I know that Randy Mui at the museum has tried to figure out the lineage of some of the materials in their collections.
Well, one last question, Jim, and it kind of impinges on something that I maybe didn't mention at the beginning when I introduced you. I didn't tell our listeners that, in fact, there is another dimension to Jim Burns that they may not know about, that you and your good wife actually are authors of historical fiction. And so one of the questions that the last question will pose is when is your next book coming out?
Oh boy. Well, I'm going to give myself a long-deserved rest from the Fire, Folly and Fiasco. Yes, Sheila and I are working on a murder mystery series. We've actually been working on it for too long, but there's so many other things that come into play and take up the time. It's a murder mystery that uses the Missing Persons Bureau, or the detective agency, that was begun by the Salvation Army in England in 1885. And the heroine of our story is a Salvation Army officer, Addie Langley, and she goes about solving murders wherever she happens to be, whether it's in London, England, or soon after that she moves to Helena, Montana. And that may sound weird, but my real great-great-grandmother was a Salvation Army officer in charge of the rescue home in Helena, Montana in the late 1800s, 1896 to 1899. And so we're basing it on historical facts. Some of the characters are real people. And it's just fun doing that kind of stuff. You create a world, and you can make the characters as eccentric as you want, and it's great fun. I've been researching my family's involvement in the Salvation Army for just about as long as the Fire, Folly and Fiasco, actually.
Well, thank you, Jim. If nothing else, what you've done is convince people that there's more to come, and they'll be looking forward to seeing your books on the Sally Ann. But more immediately, of course, we have Fire, Folly and Fiasco, which is available at McNally Robinson. And maybe I'll turn it back to John Taves just to tell our listeners how they can arrange to get a copy of the book for themselves. Again, Jim, thank you so much. A wonderful evening, very informative, and it's a worthwhile book. I'm so glad that I had a role in a very small one, but a role in putting it together. Thank you.
Thank you, Gordon.
And thank you both so very much for everything this evening. I'll quickly go over the purchase procedure, because I'm sure all of you out there are looking to see how you can get a copy of this book right now. We do have ample stock at McNally Robinson Booksellers right now, both at Grant Park and at the Forks. So please do feel free to get in touch. You can order the books online, you can order them over the phone, you can come in person, and we also ship both nationally and we deliver within the city as well. So you don't even have to leave your home to have a copy of this book arrive at your house. I'd like to thank everybody involved in this event. Thank you so much to Sheila at Woolly Mammoth Publishing for helping to pull this evening together and working behind the scenes so incredibly diligently. I'd like to express great thanks to Gordon Goldsborough as well for sharing his own incredible knowledge with us here this evening. I'm only the slightest peripheral player on any historical scene here in Winnipeg, but just working at the bookstore and seeing what he brings to the discussion of history within the city has been incredible. So I can only imagine all he's out there doing that I'm not party to at all. We're very privileged to have you here in the city, Gordon. We're also incredibly privileged to have James Burns here with us this evening as well, speaking of incredible breadth of knowledge. Thank you for that incredibly engaging presentation, and also for putting together this book. I should also stress that you never need to apologize for puns at a book launch, as they're essential. Paul Newsom in the comments pointed out that this is a fascinating discussion about a fascinating book, and that's entirely true. So once again, copies of the book are available at McNally Robinson Booksellers. I'd like to thank all of you out there for joining us here this evening and for all your questions and for your attention. It's been a real pleasure and a privilege to be a part of tonight. Have a very good night, everyone.